In the early 1960s, in the quiet community of Whalley in Surrey, daily life moved at a predictable pace. Neighbors recognized familiar routines, and families lived without expecting disruption. Yet within this ordinary setting, a contradiction took shape. A mother of two, last seen in her own yard, vanished without leaving any sign of departure. No witness recalled movement, no belongings were taken, and no disturbance was heard. The absence settled in slowly, almost unnoticed, until years later it became a question that no one could answer. How could someone disappear so completely from a place where nothing ever happened? Lucy Ann Johnson lived in one of those small, tidy houses on 145A Street. Born in 1935 in Alaska, she had grown up in a cold, remote environment before settling in Canada. By the time she turned 26, she had a small family of her own. A husband named Marvin and two children, Linda and Daniel. To the outside world, she carried the quiet, calm presence of someone who preferred a predictable day. Her neighbors recalled her soft voice, her polite nods, and the way she stayed close to her home. She spent most mornings tending the small yard, preparing meals, or watching over her children when they played in front of the house. She rarely shared personal stories, and no one remembered seeing her upset or acting strangely. The Johnson household was not one that drew attention. Marvin worked long hours and kept to himself. The children, still in early school years, played with each other more often than with other kids on the street. Most of the neighbors accepted the family as simply private. Nothing about their home suggested trouble or conflict. People saw a woman caring for her children, a man going to work, and a family living an ordinary life. As summer of 1961 moved into its final weeks, Lucy was seen as usual, watering plants, walking with Linda, or stepping out to check the mail. The last confirmed sighting came in early September, when one neighbor observed her standing near the front steps with her daughter. The two exchanged a brief, casual wave. There was nothing unusual about Lucy's appearance or behavior. She did not seem hurried or distressed. She did not mention travel, visitors, or plans to go anywhere. The scene was unremarkable, and for that reason, it stayed in the neighbor's memory. The following morning, something felt slightly different, though no one understood why at first. Lucy was not outside with her children. The yard, usually active in the early hours, was quiet. At the time, there was nothing alarming about it. People had daily tasks, errands, and reasons to stay indoors. Yet when the same silence continued the next day, a few neighbors began to take notice. Lucy was a woman of routine. She did not disappear from view for long stretches unless she was inside caring for the children. But even the children were quieter than usual, playing closer to the house, not running around the yard as often. Within a few days, the absence became more noticeable. There were no signs of Lucy walking to the local shop. No one saw her tending to her small flower bed. The curtains in the front room remained drawn more often. Still, Whalley in the 1960s was not a place where people immediately asked personal questions. Many assumed she was visiting relatives, feeling unwell, or occupied with tasks at home. Inside the Johnson house, however, the details told a different story, one that would only be understood years later. Lucy's belongings were still in their usual places. Clothes in the closet, simple jewelry on the dresser, household tools neatly arranged in the kitchen. Her purse remained in the bedroom, along with identification papers and small items she used daily. Nothing suggested she was planning a trip. No suitcase was missing. No note was found. Even her shoes, pairs she often wore, were still by the door. There were no signs of a struggle, no noise reported during the night, no broken objects or displaced furniture. Everything in the house looked untouched, as if she had stepped away for only a moment. The strangeness lay in the lack of interruption. A disappearance marked not by chaos, but by absolute silence. As the days passed, a few neighbors exchanged quiet comments about not seeing Lucy lately. One woman noted that the house seemed too still, unusual for a family with 2 young children. Others simply assumed she was dealing with personal matters. In a time when adults could travel without formal notice, and neighbors rarely intervened in private affairs, the absence did not immediately raise alarm. People kept their thoughts to themselves, thinking the situation would resolve naturally. But there was one undeniable fact. No one had seen Lucy leave the house. Not by car, not on foot, not stepping onto a bus at the end of the street. There were no reports of her visiting stores or speaking with anyone in the days leading up to her disappearance. She did not call relatives, did not mail letters, and did not collect her bank savings. Her life, almost overnight, stopped leaving traces. By the end of September 1961, the neighborhood settled back into its usual rhythm, despite quiet curiosity lingering beneath the surface. The Johnson house continued its routines, children going outside briefly, Marvin commuting to work. But the woman who had once moved steadily through the home's small routines was no longer seen. And from that undefined day in September 1961, Lucy Ann Johnson was gone, vanished from her life, her street, and her family, without a sound, without a farewell, and without a single clear sign of where she had gone. For nearly 4 years after Lucy's disappearance, no official report was filed. The neighborhood grew used to the quietness around the Johnson home, and life in Wally moved steadily into the mid-1960s. It was not unusual in those years for families to keep personal matters private, and the lack of immediate action allowed the absence to settle like a forgotten detail. That silence remained undisturbed until May 14, 1965. On that day, Marvin Johnson walked into the local RCMP detachment and reported that his wife, Lucy Ann Johnson, had been missing for several years. His appearance at the station marked the point when the case truly began. The officers who received the report recognized immediately that the timing was not ordinary. Missing adult cases were common, especially when a person left voluntarily or moved elsewhere without informing neighbors. But a delay of nearly 4 years raised questions that could not be ignored. The duty officer noted the timeline in his logbook, paused for clarification, and asked Marvin to recount his last clear memory of his wife. His response was vague. He said he had last seen Lucy sometime in 1961, unable to provide a specific date or situation. He claimed she left the house and never returned. When asked why he had waited so long, he said he believed she would come back, and that he had managed his home and children alone since then. Within hours, RCMP opened a file and assigned investigators to conduct the first round of interviews. Missing person protocols in the 1960s differed greatly from modern standards, but even then, officers recognized the unusual nature of a 4-year gap. Their first step was to speak with people who had lived near the Johnson family in 1961. Neighbors expressed surprise that the matter was only now being reported. Some admitted they had assumed Lucy was away visiting relatives. Others had thought she had taken temporary work elsewhere. A few remembered wondering silently why she no longer appeared in the yard or walked with her daughter, though none had felt it their place to intervene. The officers recorded these statements carefully. The most consistent detail was the same one noted in the original logs. Early September 1961 was the last time anyone recalled seeing Lucy. The investigators then moved to the next logical step, examining the Johnson property. They visited the home, now worn slightly by time, and observed its layout, the yard space, and the small basement Marvin used as storage. Nothing at first glance suggested disorder. The house appeared lived in, but not neglected. When questioned inside his home, Marvin's responses remained short and measured. He repeated that Lucy had left with no explanation, He claimed she sometimes visited relatives, though he could not name where those relatives lived or when she had contacted them last. His statements lacked detail, and investigators struggled to pin down even simple sequences of events. They asked about arguments, illnesses, travel, or unusual behavior in 1961. He denied all of these. As the conversation continued, the officers noted the inconsistencies. A man who had waited 4 years to report a disappearance, yet who could not provide even basic context about his wife's final days at home. Given the circumstances, RCMP expanded the search. They spoke again with neighbors, extending the range to several blocks. A retired couple living adjacent to the Johnsons provided the most specific recollection, seeing Lucy near the front yard with her daughter early that September. They could not recall hearing anything unusual afterward. No late-night noise, no visitors, no vehicle leaving at an odd hour. The couple emphasized that the house had remained outwardly calm throughout those weeks. With limited external information, investigators initiated a standard procedure of the time: a physical search of the property. Several officers returned days later with tools to examine the yard. Digging began in areas where soil appeared disturbed or uneven. The work lasted hours, and the team remained cautious, knowing such tasks could reveal difficult answers. Yet by the time they finished, no signs of buried items or concealed evidence were found. The ground contained only ordinary household debris from prior decades. Inside the home, officers inspected furniture, closets, drawers, and storage areas. If Lucy had left voluntarily, some items, clothing, personal documents, or sentimental belongings, would typically be missing. However, her belongings remained untouched. Dresses hung in the closet. Small personal items lay neatly where they had always been. Her purse, with trivial contents like coins, a comb, and an old note, remained stored in the bedroom. This absence of movement puzzled investigators. A person who planned to leave usually took at least one essential object. Lucy had taken nothing, or so it appeared. Officers then attempted to locate any relatives she might have contacted. With the limited communication methods of the time, this process required letters, phone calls, and coordination with other jurisdictions. No family in Alaska reported hearing from her. No friends or extended relatives had received letters. No employer had a record of her applying for work, and no hospital had a match for her description. It was as if her name had simply vanished from the usual paths a person's life might follow. As evidence continued to yield nothing, the focus naturally returned to the person who had lived with her: Marvin. In similar cases, the spouse often held information, whether accurate, incomplete, or withheld, that could clarify events. RCMP conducted multiple interviews with him. They asked about his relationship with Lucy, the routines in the home, and any signs she might have been planning to leave. Marvin denied any conflict, provided no explanation for her remaining possessions, and repeated that he assumed she would return. Investigators found themselves in a difficult position. Suspicion existed, but suspicion alone was not grounds for charges. There were no witnesses, no clear motive established, and no physical evidence linking anyone to wrongdoing. Marvin's behavior raised questions, but questions without evidence could not move a case forward. Officers noted their concerns in the file, but the absence of clear information prevented any further legal action. The community, too, gradually accepted the uncertainty. Some believed Lucy had left voluntarily. Others quietly wondered if an unreported tragedy had occurred. But without facts, all thoughts remained only theories. The children continued growing under their father's care, and the Johnson house remained part of the neighborhood landscape, carrying a silence no one knew how to interpret. By late 1965, the investigation had reached its limit. RCMP had searched the property, interviewed neighbors, reviewed possible travel paths, and attempted contact with relatives. Nothing pointed toward a destination, a reason, or a cause. With no new leads, the case moved into a quiet standstill. And so, within months of being opened, the disappearance of Lucy Ann Johnson entered its first long pause, one that would last nearly half a century. As the months following the initial investigation stretched into years, the disappearance of Lucy Ann Johnson gradually moved from an active inquiry into the quiet space where unresolved cases tend to settle. The RCMP file, once handled frequently during those first weeks, was transferred to long-term storage, revisited only when a new officer reviewed old records or when unidentified remains surfaced somewhere in the province. Yet even those checks yielded no connections. Despite the occasional burst of activity, the dominant atmosphere surrounding the case became stillness. Inside the Johnson home, daily life continued, though not without strain. Marvin Johnson raised the children alone, maintaining predictable routines that gave the appearance of stability. Neighbors saw Linda and Daniel walking to school, returning home, and helping with simple chores. They grew older while the absence of their mother faded into a pattern of quiet omission. Few questions were asked aloud. In communities of that time, personal matters were rarely examined by outsiders unless circumstances demanded special attention. And in this case, without evidence of conflict or visible disorder, the household simply appeared to be a small family, adjusting to its own private rhythm. Within the RCMP, Lucy's case resurfaced periodically only when unidentified remains were discovered somewhere across British Columbia. Each time, officers retrieved the file, compared physical descriptions, cross-checked timelines, and sought dental or medical records. But Lucy had left behind few such documents. Comprehensive identification methods of the era were limited, and in each instance, the remains belonged to someone else. Each false match reinforced an uncomfortable truth. There was no trail, not even a faint one. Through the 1970s and 1980s, investigative standards improved significantly, but older cases often remained constrained by the limitations of their original files. When new RCMP officers encountered Lucy's name, they saw a disappearance reported nearly 4 years late, a property search that had yielded nothing, and no evidence of travel, injury, or communication. With no leads emerging, no sightings reported, and no escalation of suspicious activity around the Johnson household, the file was consistently assessed as low probability for reactivation. Yet patterns sometimes linger beneath the surface, waiting for years before they become visible. In Lucy's case, one such pattern involved her husband's early behavior. Marvin Johnson had been questioned thoroughly in the 1960s, but without evidence, suspicion had nowhere to settle. He lived without further incidents, held jobs intermittently, and raised his children. He rarely spoke of his wife. To the few who attempted to ask, he gave short replies, implying she had left by choice or that she was living with relatives. These statements were vague but consistent, and without contrary information, they drifted into the background of the community's collective memory. For the children, the absence shaped their lives in quieter, more personal ways. Linda retained faint memories of her mother. Small gestures, a voice, a scent of soap. But as years passed, those fragments softened. Daniel, younger still when Lucy vanished, remembered almost nothing. They grew into adolescence with limited understanding of what had happened, relying on the minimal explanations provided by their father. The topic became one that neither of them pressed. Silence, over time, became easier than uncertainty. Through the late 1980s, the Johnson family's life continued to evolve. The children eventually left home, establishing their own households, carrying with them the unanswered question that had lingered since childhood. Marvin aged quietly. He remarried at one point, though details of that relationship remained private. Neighbors observed that he seldom spoke of the past and rarely engaged in conversations involving Lucy's name. For some, his silence intensified early suspicions. For others, it reflected the reticence of a man who had experienced a domestic rupture he preferred not to reopen. Without evidence, all interpretations remained only conjecture. The legal system also had its limits. Without clear proof of wrongdoing, no charges could be laid. The early excavation of the yard had produced nothing. No witness had come forward to indicate conflict or violence. No record indicated that Lucy had sought help before she vanished. And despite the lack of contact, there was no documentation proving she had met harm. In the absence of direct evidence, the case remained suspended between possibilities. Neither closed nor active, neither resolved nor forgotten. What changed quietly throughout these decades, however, was the perspective of one person. Lucy's daughter, Linda. As she entered adulthood, questions that had felt too heavy to ask during childhood resurfaced with sharper clarity. She wondered how a mother could disappear entirely, without leaving a single trace. She wondered why the case had never advanced, why her father had reported the disappearance so late, and why no one seemed able to explain any part of the timeline. Over time, these questions became a quiet weight she carried into her later life. She built her own family, experienced the responsibilities of motherhood, and with each passing year, the absence of answers felt increasingly unfinished. Meanwhile, the RCMP continued periodic reviews of cold cases, though Lucy's file rarely yielded new insight. Officers who handled the file during the 1990s observed that Marvin Johnson had died of natural causes. With his death, an entire avenue of potential information closed permanently. If he had held details about Lucy's disappearance, they were lost with him. In many ways, his passing marked a turning point. Even though no new evidence surfaced, the absence of the one person who had lived with Lucy in her final known months altered how the case was viewed. Some officers quietly wondered if the truth had been buried decades earlier, beyond reach. By the early 2000s, the case had reached nearly 40 years without progress. Investigators occasionally checked unidentified remains through DNA testing, which had become more accessible, though resources were limited and older cases rarely received priority. Still, each test returned negative. No match emerged. No record of travel, employment, or relocation surfaced under Lucy's name. The absence remained complete. As the decades passed, the disappearance gained a different weight. Instead of an active mystery, it became a question suspended across generations. To Linda, it came to represent both a personal loss and an unresolved fragment of her identity. For the RCMP, it stood as one among many cold cases, silent, incomplete, and unreachable without new evidence or witness testimony. For the community, Lucy's story faded into distant memory. And yet, in the space preserved by uncertainty, the possibility of truth, whatever shape it might take, remained. This long era of quiet, stretching nearly half a century, would end only when a new approach emerged in an unexpected decade. And it would begin not with a new clue, but with a renewed effort by those who had lived longest with unanswered questions. Nearly 50 years after Lucy Ann Johnson was last seen, her disappearance remained suspended in a static space of unresolved questions. The RCMP file, stored among hundreds of cold cases, had accumulated layers of handwritten notes, outdated contact numbers, and forms from a different era of policing. What had not changed was the fundamental absence. No confirmed sightings, no communication, and no physical evidence. Yet in June 2013, a shift occurred. Not because of a new clue, but because of a renewed decision inside the Surrey RCMP to highlight long-standing unsolved cases through a public awareness initiative. Lucy's case, chosen for their Missing of the Month campaign, was placed back into the public eye for the first time in decades. When the RCMP media unit drafted the summary, they relied on the sparse historical details available. Lucy was last seen in 1961, reported missing in 1965, and believed by early investigators to have possibly met harm. They also noted the extensive yard excavation and the lack of supporting evidence against her husband. The statement did not draw conclusions. It simply presented the facts that remained. The release served a practical purpose. Long-term cases often benefit from generational turnover, where new community members, relocated families, or descendants might recognize a name long forgotten by the original residents. The decision to feature her case gained more attention than expected. Local newspapers published short articles, and regional radio stations mentioned her name. For the first time in decades, people who had once lived in the neighborhood recalled fragments from the early 1960s. A woman who rarely socialized, a household that kept to itself, and a sudden silence that had followed her disappearance. These recollections did not generate concrete leads, but they revived a question that had lain dormant for more than half a century. The person most affected by the renewed attention, however, was her daughter, Linda Evans. Now, a grown woman with a family of her own, she viewed the RCMP notice not as a formality, but as a signal that time had not closed the possibility of truth. The decades separating her from her mother's last known days had done little to soften her questions. Instead, they had made the absence sharper, more defined, especially as she reflected on her own experience of raising children. What had once been quiet acceptance of uncertainty gradually shifted into a desire for clarity. In reviewing the RCMP summary, Linda realized that much of the original file relied almost entirely on information supplied by her father. The late reporting, the lack of documented conflict, and the absence of any alternative explanation had shaped the course of the case. She understood that early investigative limitations might have narrowed the lens through which her mother's disappearance was viewed. For the first time, she considered whether she might find answers not by relying on the official record, but by looking beyond it, specifically into the places her mother had lived before arriving in British Columbia. Her decision to conduct a personal inquiry began quietly. She searched through old drawers and boxes that had belonged to her father, hoping to find clues, letters, photographs, or identification documents. In one box, she discovered old papers suggesting that her mother had once lived in the Yukon, long before beginning her life in Surrey. The information was minimal, but it provided a starting point, a point she had never previously questioned. Believing that someone in the Yukon might recall the Carvel family or recognize her mother's maiden name, she prepared a short message and sent it to the Yukon News for publication. The plea was direct, but free of assumptions. She listed her mother's birth name, birth date, and the names of her grandparents. Her intention was not to present a theory, but to open a door to the possibility that someone, somewhere, might hold a piece of her mother's story that she had never been told. The response came sooner than she expected. A woman from Whitehorse contacted her, stating that her own mother, whose age, background, and early life details aligned precisely with those of Lucy Ann Carvel, was still alive. The message was cautious, but clear. The woman explained that her mother did not disappear through mysterious circumstances, nor had she met harm. Instead, she had left Surrey in the early 1960s and had begun a new life in the Yukon, later remarrying and raising 4 additional children. When Linda read the message, she faced a moment that was both startling and quiet. For more than 50 years, she had lived with the belief that her mother had either suffered harm or vanished beyond trace. She now confronted a new possibility, that her mother had been alive all this time, but living elsewhere outside the reach of official records and separate from the family she had once been part of. Her next step was measured. Before responding, she contacted the RCMP to relay the possibility that her mother had been located. Investigators, though cautious, immediately recognized the significance of the claim. They checked available information, verified names, and examined records from the Yukon. Although the early confirmation was limited, nothing contradicted the possibility. With the absence of evidence indicating harm, the case trajectory shifted dramatically. Within days, Linda exchanged direct communication with the woman who had contacted her. The details aligned too precisely to dismiss. The birth date, the relatives' names, and the early life in Alaska all matched her mother's known history. The woman added that her mother had spoken sparingly about her life before the Yukon, mentioning only that she had once tried to take her children with her, but had not been allowed to do so. This information brought the outline of a narrative that had been missing from the original investigation. The possibility that Lucy had left voluntarily due to circumstances at home. In the early 1960s, laws relating to domestic conflict were limited, documentation was rare, and police intervention in private matters was considerably more restrained than in later decades. Without records, without visible injury, and without reports, early investigators had not considered departure by choice as a central possibility. Yet the new information placed this scenario firmly back into view. When Linda finally confirmed through direct conversation that the woman in the Yukon was indeed her mother, the RCMP closed, the case as resolved. The formal record shifted from missing under suspicious circumstances to located alive. The discovery did not erase the decades of silence, nor did it explain the choices made in the early 1960s. But the central question, was she alive or not, had at last been answered. What followed would not be the unraveling of a crime, but the beginning of reconnection after half a century apart. And the path toward that moment would unfold in the next chapter, shaped not by investigation, but by the quiet work of rebuilding a family divided by time and circumstance. The confirmation that Lucy Ann Johnson was alive did not immediately translate into a reunion. For her daughter, Linda Evans, the revelation carried both relief and uncertainty. For the first time in more than 50 years, the absolute silence surrounding her mother's absence had been replaced by a voice on the other end of a telephone line. Calm, elderly, and familiar in ways she could not yet fully comprehend. But between the recognition of identity and the act of meeting face to face lay a delicate stretch of emotional distance that both mother and daughter needed time to navigate. Lucy, now in her late 70s, lived quietly in the Yukon, with the family she had built during her second life. Her days were structured by routines typical of small northern communities: early mornings, neighbors who knew one another by name, and an environment where histories did not need to be explained unless someone chose to share them. She had raised 4 additional children, all adults by the time Linda made contact. To them, their mother was a steady presence, reserved, practical, and careful with personal stories from before the 1970s. The sudden resurfacing of a daughter she had left behind more than half a century earlier reopened memories Lucy had long kept protected. Before agreeing to meet, Lucy asked for time to speak with her children. The conversation was said to be quiet, factual, and free of dramatization. She explained that long before she lived in the Yukon, she had 2 children in British Columbia, but had left them due to what she described as a difficult and restrictive home situation. She said she had tried to bring her children with her, but had been prevented, and afterward she no longer believed she could re-enter their lives without causing additional disruption. Her decision to remain silent for decades, though painful in retrospect, had been shaped by the belief that they were better off staying in the life they already knew. For Linda, hearing this explanation, without anger, without accusation, shifted the emotional landscape she had carried since childhood. Her earliest memories of her mother were faded, shaped mostly by absence and by discussions that revolved around unanswered questions rather than clear recollections. The possibility that her mother had left to protect herself or to protect her children introduced a perspective she had never been able to consider before. Linda understood that reconnecting would require both sides to accept the difference between the life that had happened and the life that might have been. When arrangements were finally made for Linda to travel to Whitehorse, she prepared herself not as someone seeking closure, but as someone meeting a parent for the first time in adulthood. She carried old photographs, some of her as a child, others from the brief years before her mother disappeared, and selected them carefully, choosing images that conveyed continuity rather than loss. She did not practice what she would say. Instead, she allowed for the possibility that the first meeting would be shaped less by conversation and more by presence. The day of the reunion unfolded without ceremony. Lucy stood waiting outside the modest home where she lived with one of her adult children. She was small, with gray hair pulled back neatly, wearing a coat suited for the northern weather. When she saw Linda approaching, she did not move quickly, nor did she appear uncertain. Instead, she held her position, allowing the moment to settle before taking a step forward. Witnesses later described the scene as simple and grounded. There were no dramatic gestures, no raised voices, and no insistence on explanations. The two women approached each other with steady, deliberate movements. When they finally reached one another, Lucy placed a hand on Linda's arm, light as if confirming that the moment was real, and then pulled her into a brief, restrained embrace that reflected 5 decades of distance, layered with a quiet willingness to reconnect. Inside the home, Lucy introduced Linda to her half-siblings. The atmosphere was courteous, even warm, but measured. Family photographs hung on the walls, representing years that Linda had not been present for. She looked at them with curiosity, not resentment, and recognized that these images formed the life her mother had built in her absence. Lucy, for her part, answered Linda's questions without defensiveness. She did not attempt to rewrite the past or present her choices as flawless. Instead, she focused on describing the conditions under which she made decisions, limited options, personal safety concerns, and the belief that leaving was the only viable path forward. One of the most striking elements of their conversation was its calmness. There were no accusations and no demands for justification. The decades between them had softened expectations, allowing both women to accept that the past would not be reconstructed piece by piece. Their dialogue centered instead on the present, how Lucy had lived, how Linda had grown, and how both of their families had developed separate roots. In the days following the reunion, Linda remained in the Yukon to spend more time with her mother. They visited the small community where Lucy had first settled after leaving British Columbia. Local residents who had known Lucy for years expressed surprise upon learning she had another family she had left behind, though none spoke critically of her. In remote communities, where hardship and reinvention are both familiar concepts, her story was understood not through judgment, but through practicality. Lucy shared fragments of her early life, recalling her childhood in Alaska, her move to British Columbia, and the challenges of her marriage to Marvin. She described a home environment marked by restriction and tension, elements she had not been able to articulate to police in the 1960s. Laws governing domestic conflict at the time were limited. Few supportive services existed, and social expectations often discouraged women from leaving even under extremely difficult circumstances. Her departure, viewed through that historical lens, reflected both desperation and determination. When Linda asked whether she had ever considered contacting her children later in life, Lucy answered with quiet honesty. She had thought about it, she said, many times, but she feared that reappearing after years of silence would reopen emotional wounds or disrupt whatever stability her children had found. She believed that the safest option, for them and herself, was to remain at a distance. As the visit neared its end, neither woman attempted to define what their relationship would become. Instead, they acknowledged that the reunion itself was significant. It did not erase the past, nor did it promise complete restoration, but it offered clarity, connection, and an opportunity to reshape the narrative that had defined both of their lives for so long. When Linda boarded the flight home, she carried with her new photographs, her mother smiling gently, her half-siblings gathered around her, and a small snapshot of the landscape that had become Lucy's refuge. These images did not replace the ones from her childhood, but they expanded the story in a way that allowed both families to move forward. The truth, once fragmented, had settled into a form both women could live with. And in its own quiet way, it answered the central question that had persisted for more than half a century. The rediscovery of Lucy Ann Johnson triggered questions that extended beyond family boundaries. For over 50 years, her disappearance had been treated as a presumed case of domestic wrongdoing, and public memory had preserved her name primarily as a symbol of unresolved loss. The moment the Royal Canadian Mounted Police confirmed she was alive, the narrative shifted from suspected crime to an unusual case of prolonged absence, raising broader questions about legal frameworks, investigative limitations, and the social expectations that shaped the original case. At the time of Lucy's disappearance in 1961, formal protocols for missing adults were limited. Law enforcement agencies often categorized adult disappearances under voluntary absence unless clear evidence indicated otherwise. This contributed to delayed initial scrutiny, though. The delay was compounded by the fact that her husband did not report her missing until 1965. When the report was finally made, investigators were confronted with a 4-year gap, an interval that diminished the likelihood of collecting reliable evidence, identifying witnesses with intact memories, or reconstructing her last known movements with precision. Police records from the period show that Marvin Johnson became the immediate focus of the investigation. His delay in reporting, combined with contradictory statements and the absence of any verifiable explanation for his wife's disappearance, gave investigators reason to consider a possible domestic offense. Excavation of the family property, interviews with neighbors, and interrogations all pointed toward the same conclusion. Something had happened to Lucy, and the husband's account could not fully explain it. However, without physical evidence, no charges could be laid. The investigation ultimately stalled, suspended between suspicion and procedural limitations. In retrospect, investigators acknowledged that the absence of early reporting created an obstacle nearly impossible to overcome. By the time forensic science advanced enough to examine cold cases more effectively, the original scene had long since changed. Even decades later, periodic checks of unidentified remains yielded no matches. The file was technically open but functionally dormant, a quiet reminder of a case without leads. Lucy's reappearance in 2013 brought these historical gaps to public attention. Legal analysts noted that although suspicions surrounding Marvin had been reasonable given the circumstances, the absence of any proven offense meant that the case, once reopened, did not involve criminal review, but rather administrative closure. Marvin had died in the 1990s. Even if evidence of wrongdoing had existed, it could no longer be prosecuted. The RCMP stated publicly that no criminal action remained pending, as Lucy confirmed she had left voluntarily due to personal circumstances. While those circumstances involved behaviors that today might fit within recognized patterns of domestic mistreatment, the legal definitions of the early 1960s were narrower, and the resources available to women in such situations were limited. This explanation, though clarifying the legal position, drew varied public reactions. Some expressed surprise that a disappearance long believed to involve violence had been the result of voluntary flight. Others focused on understanding the social context that shaped Lucy's decisions. Many viewed her departure not as abandonment, but as a reflection of the limited avenues available to women facing domestic challenges in that era. Discussions emerged across Canadian media concerning historical patterns of gendered vulnerability, community silence, and the absence of institutional support systems at the time. In Surrey, where Lucy had lived before disappearing, longtime neighbors recalled the years of uncertainty that followed. For them, the rediscovery of Lucy was both unexpected and clarifying. They remembered the police digging in the yard, the speculation, and the concern that something irreversible had occurred. For decades, her name had surfaced periodically during community discussions of cold cases. The confirmation that she was alive allowed many residents to reframe their understanding of events that had shaped public perception in the 1960s. For law enforcement, the case became a study in procedural challenges and the importance of sustained investigative review. The RCMP later noted that reopening dormant files through public outreach, such as the Missing of the Month initiative, proved effective in generating new information, especially when cases lacked digital-era documentation. Lucy's daughter finding vital clues through personal inquiry highlighted the value of combined institutional and family-led efforts, particularly for older cases where official records were incomplete. The emotional dimension of the rediscovery, though personal to the families involved, also contributed to the public's response. Many were struck by the fact that two families, separated by decades, geography, and silence, had formed around the same individual without knowledge of each other. The reunion, rather than serving as evidence of wrongdoing or vindication, became a testament to human resilience. Lucy's 4 children in the Yukon expressed willingness to meet their half-siblings, and Linda Evans conveyed respect for the life her mother had built. This mutual acceptance, steady and measured, stood in contrast to narratives of confrontation often expected in reunions following long disappearances. In legal terms, the case closed quietly. In human terms, it reopened long-standing questions about how individuals navigate personal safety, restricted choices, and the boundaries of family responsibility. Lucy's decision to leave, though understood differently by each person affected, reflected the complex intersection of private struggle and limited societal support in her era. Her silence for decades was shaped not by indifference, but by her belief that re-entry into her children's lives might cause further disruption. The RCMP released a formal closing summary. The individual reported missing had been located alive. No further investigative action was required. The concise language of the report contrasted with the layers of personal history that had unfolded behind the scenes. For the public, the case served as a reminder that disappearance does not always equate to crime, and that the passage of time can reshape both understanding and judgment. As news coverage subsided, attention turned to the impact on the families involved. Linda described her mother's explanation as difficult but comprehensible within its historical context. She stated that her goal had never been to assign blame, but to understand what had happened. Her half-siblings in the Yukon approached the situation with openness, recognizing that the expansion of their family, though unexpected, was not unwelcome. In the end, the legal closure of the case did not define its significance. Instead, the public remembered it as one of the longest disappearances to conclude with a living reunion, a rare resolution in cold case investigations. The absence of a criminal element did not diminish the weight of the story. Rather, it illustrated how the realities of personal history can diverge sharply from assumptions shaped by silence and time. The case of Lucy Ann Johnson reaffirmed a fundamental principle that applies across investigative work. The truth of a disappearance is often multidimensional, shaped by circumstances that cannot be fully understood until all parties are able or willing to speak. In the months that followed the reunion, the lives of both families gradually settled into a new rhythm. The rediscovery of Lucy Ann Johnson had brought resolution to one of Canada's longest-running missing person cases, but the significance of the reunion lay less in closing a file and more in the quiet restructuring of relationships shaped by time, absence, and renewed understanding. For Linda Evans, returning to British Columbia after meeting her mother marked the start of an internal shift. She no longer carried the weight of uncertainty that had accompanied her since childhood. Instead, she held a clearer sense of origin, one that included both the years she lived with her father and the history that had unfolded beyond her view. Adjusting to that expanded identity required patience. She maintained contact with her mother through occasional calls and letters, each exchange measured and careful, building familiarity at a pace comfortable for both sides. Linda's brother Daniel chose a quieter approach. He acknowledged the reunion, but preferred to observe from a distance. His memories of early childhood were faint, and the emotional landscape of reconnecting felt unfamiliar. Yet he expressed relief that the story had reached clarity, even if he chose not to participate directly. For him, closure came not through reunion, but through understanding that the unanswered questions of his youth now had context. In the Yukon, Lucy's children reacted with a mix of curiosity and acceptance. Their mother's past, which she had long guarded, became a part of family conversations, not as a source of conflict, but as an element of her life that had shaped who she became. They welcomed the idea of distant siblings, seeing the reunion not as a loss of exclusivity, but as an expansion of family ties. Their willingness to meet Linda again in the future demonstrated a grounded approach to integrating new relationships. Lucy herself resumed her routine with quiet steadiness. She remained private, speaking of her past only when necessary, yet she demonstrated a subtle shift in demeanor after reconnecting with Linda. According to those close to her, she seemed lighter in her conversations, still reserved, but more open to reflecting on experiences she had previously kept tightly contained. At 77, she did not attempt to rebuild a full presence in her earlier family's lives, nor did she retreat from the contact that now existed. Instead, she balanced the two worlds with the same practicality that had carried her through her years of reinvention. Community response in the Yukon and in Surrey evolved with time. The initial curiosity faded, replaced by a respectful awareness that the case, once the subject of speculation, had ended in a way few expected, with an explanation grounded in personal circumstances rather than criminal activity. Local organizations occasionally referenced the case when discussing long-term missing persons, noting that outcomes can vary tremendously and that assumptions often obscure the quieter realities behind disappearances. Among law enforcement, the case continued to serve as a reference point. The RCMP emphasized the value of revisiting older files through public engagement, recognizing that family participation can reveal crucial information unattainable through formal channels alone. The story of Linda locating her mother by tracing historical records and appealing to local newspapers reinforced the importance of multi-directional investigation, official and personal working in parallel. Training materials for cold case review units occasionally cited the Johnson disappearance as an example of the need for persistence, even when early documentation is incomplete. In academia, a few researchers examining historical patterns of missing women in Canada referenced Lucy's case when discussing how domestic constraints and limited support networks shaped disappearances during the mid-20th century. Her story highlighted the broader societal pressures that influenced personal decisions, particularly for women navigating restrictive household environments. These studies approached the case analytically, without moral judgment, emphasizing how context and available resources affect the choices individuals make under pressure. For Linda, the long-term impact of the reunion surfaced in subtle ways. She began documenting parts of her own life. Family photographs, written reflections, copies of correspondence, so that her children and grandchildren would have records she never had access to. Her approach was not driven by fear of repeating history, but by a desire to ensure that future generations would not experience the same absence of information. In interviews, she described the reunion not as the restoration of a lost relationship, but as the completion of a story that had remained unfinished for too long. Lucy's Yukon family also adjusted to the new reality with steady acceptance. Her children, now adults with families of their own, continued to invite Linda to future gatherings. While geographical distance prevented frequent visits, their communication remained consistent enough to maintain a sense of connection. Through these exchanges, the two branches of the family found a way to coexist without forcing sudden closeness. This gradual, respectful integration demonstrated an understanding that unity can be built without erasing the decades that had shaped each life separately. From a broader perspective, the case became a quiet reminder that time does not always erase the possibility of reconnection. For many families of long-term missing individuals, the outcome provided a measure of hope. Not in the expectation that every disappearance would resolve similarly, but in the acknowledgement that certainty is sometimes achieved in unexpected ways. Organizations dedicated to locating missing persons referenced Lucy's story as an example of why dormant cases should not be disregarded. The emotional legacy of the case extended beyond the moment of reunion. It lay in the nuanced understanding that emerged afterward, that the past could not be rewritten, but it could be reframed, that relationships disrupted by circumstance could find new footing, and that closure does not always arrive through dramatic revelation, but through measured understanding rooted in truth. As time moved forward, the story of Lucy Ann Johnson receded gradually from public attention, settling into the archives of unusual disappearances resolved after decades. Yet within her family, the significance endured. Linda kept a small framed photograph from her Yukon visit on a shelf in her home. A picture of her mother standing beside her, both women dressed for the northern weather, both looking directly at the camera with expressions that reflected calm rather than celebration. It was a quiet testament to the way unresolved stories can find their conclusion, not through recovery of the past, but through acceptance of the present. For Lucy, the final chapter of her life unfolded peacefully in the community she had chosen half a century earlier. Her days continued as they had before, but now carried a layer of openness that had been absent for decades. She had lived two lives, one shaped by constraint, the other by renewal, and the reunion with her daughter had allowed the two timelines to meet, not perfectly, but respectfully. In the end, the legacy of the case was neither sensational nor defined by conflict. It was a story of survival shaped by circumstance, a story of rediscovery made possible through persistence, and a story of family rebuilt through understanding rather than expectation. And in its quiet way, it offered a reminder that truth, even when delayed, retains the power to reshape the lives it touches. If you found this reconstruction clear and thought-provoking, consider liking, sharing, and subscribing for more long-form investigative narratives. Tell me where you're watching from and which case you want explored next. Your suggestions help shape future stories and keep these long-buried mysteries alive.